In this video lecture, I will talk about what every criminal justice professional should know about child testimonies. It's, of course, a very brief lecture, so it's just grasping some key elements of this, but there will be further reading provided at the end of the lecture. My name is Julia Korkman. I'm a senior program officer at HEUNI, the European Institute for Crime Prevention and Control, affiliated with the United Nations, and also an associate professor at Åbo Academy and a professor of practice. And my research has, among other things, focused on child investigative interviewing and assessing children's credibility when assessing their accounts in court. The recommendations I will go through today are based on a large or a white paper conducted by a large pool of experts throughout Europe. These are all experts that are part of the European Association on Psychology and Law. And among these experts are several senior academic scholars, also persons pursuing their PhDs, as well as practitioners with extensive experience in conducting child abuse investigations or other issues pertaining to how children are heard in court. This paper is open access, so it is found easily online. And we have also condensed these 10 key recommendations that we are giving ample advice on in the long paper into a short policy brief. And this policy brief you can find on HEUNI's homepage, and it is now published in numerous different languages. I must say also that during the drafting of these recommendations, the task was actually easier than it may seem, considering the fact that there was a huge number of experts from very different countries. And I think this is because the research is quite clear. We have a lot of research on how children should be heard in criminal justice proceedings. And that research is not very problematic or conflicting. It is actually, there's quite a coherence in the scientific findings. So among the recommendations, we start with recommendation 1, which is understanding child victims and witnesses. This means that anyone who is conducting investigative interviews with children, and preferably also those who assess those child testimonies, have to have some kind of understanding of how children develop, what are their vulnerabilities compared to older persons, and what is the best evidence regarding how their account should be extracted. So forensic child interviews must be conducted by specialized professionals. You cannot just assume that any police officer or any social worker or psychologist or medical doctor would have in their background education the necessary information. There is, in fact, no training that I know of which would include everything that a good forensic child interviewer has to know. So this is specialized regardless of your professional background. And I may add to this that in Europe, several different professional groups actually conduct forensic child interviews. And my personal assumption is that actually the basic education that the person has is not that significant. What is significant is that they get specialized training and feedback. We'll come back to that later. But interviewing requires an understanding of developmental issues, suggestibility, the fact that children can be very easily suggested by adults. So children are kind of built to try to respond to adults in a way that satisfies the adults. You could say even it's a very important survival mechanism for them. Hence, if an adult poses leading questions to a child, like, well, you didn't like that, did you? Children are almost or are very prone to say no, because they get it. They understand that the adult wants them to say no. And if you have this kind of interview, which unfortunately we see still today in many cases, this really will lead to a very high risk that the child will provide information not based on what they think or know happened, but based on how they assume that the adult wants them to respond. And this is not the same as children deliberately lying or making things up. This is really a crucial way for them to communicate so that adults are happy with what they are doing. And of course, children are dependent on adults in their everyday life. So you could say it's even a social survival strategy. You also need to understand memory and language. And while, of course, understanding memory is important for anyone conducting investigative interviews with a person of any age, it is crucial to understand that children's memory develops, of course, during childhood, and that the younger the child is, the more obstacles there are to memories. It's not that young children, preschool children, could not remember at all things that happen. On the contrary, children actually start remembering when they are in utero. So there are some memories formed, but they are not memories that they can later verbalize or kind of remember as happenings. It's more recognizing familiar voices or sounds or even tastes. But as children grow, they will start remembering things that they have that have happened to them. And when they learn to talk fluently, to talk in sentences, then they also learn to kind of structure these memories in their mind. So language and memory are highly intertwined. And it's also important to understand that it's not that children would have poor memory. We know that young children, 2-year-olds, for instance, they learn incredible amounts of new information every day. But they have so little life experience that it's kind of random how this information pops up, and it's hard for them perhaps to assess where that information goes. So for an adult, for a mother, father, another relative who's with the child a lot and who has experienced the situations with the child, if the child says the dog and the ball, the adult will know what they are talking about. But providing the kind of going back to previous situations and talk about them with an unfamiliar adult who was not there is much more requiring. So that's a whole different thing. Therefore, sometimes parents think that their children are really good at describing their experiences, but in a forensic interview situation with an unfamiliar adult, children may struggle quite a bit to express themselves in a way that this adult understands. Usually, there is, of course, no exact age range of when children can be interviewed, but it's often around the age of 4. So before the age of 4, there certainly may be individual children who have very highly developed memory and linguistic skills, but I think they would be in a minority. And still 4-year-olds may struggle quite a bit. Then at 5, many fewer struggle. So if they have experienced something relatively recently and they still have that memory intact, they have not been discussed with in a suggestive way by other adults, for instance, then there is a good chance they may be able to talk about it if they want to, if they trust the person they are talking to, or if the situation is such that it actually allows them to do so. So this is one of the factors related to disclosure. And there's quite a lot of research on whether and how and if children disclose, for instance, abusive events to unfamiliar adults and also to familiar adults for that matter. And we know that, for instance, children who have experienced violence in their home may struggle to disclose. And we also know that the way in which the interviewer creates rapport and explains the situation to the child is very important for whether or not they will disclose, and also for whether or not they will give as much information as they actually can. So this creating rapport and supporting the child throughout the interview are absolutely crucial elements of any investigative interview, and certainly also with children. And when we talk about younger children, it does help if you have experience with younger children, not as a parent, but as a professional, because talking to a child you're familiar with in your own life is a completely different matter compared to actually conducting an investigative interview. And this is important to note because that's a common misconception that a person who's generally good with children would be kind of a good investigative interviewer. It's not necessarily the case. It's a different set of skills altogether. So evidence-based child interviewing implies that interviewers are trained and that they use evidence-based methods. And luckily, we have already since decades quite well-conducted research on what to avoid when interviewing children and what to emphasize. So there are quite practical and clear guidances on how to, for instance, formulate open-ended questions in a way that a young child can understand and can respond to, and that is not leading. It's not it's easier to say than to do in practice. I have worked with child interviews for many, many years in practice myself. I find it much easier to talk about how it should be done than to do it. And I think this is an experience that is shared by practitioners and experts throughout. But it certainly is helpful to have this evidence-based guidance based on which you plan the interview and you conduct the interview and you assess the interview afterwards. That's the way to learn this skill. The interview protocol that is most researched and most used also in Europe is the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, NICHD protocol. It has already a revised version where focus is even more on creating rapport and supporting the child throughout the interview. There are others very similar that are also, my guess is, equally good if they are focusing on creating rapport, having an open-ended mind, allowing the child to provide answers through open-ended questions. These are really the crucial things. Most of the research on child interviews has been conducted on child victims of crimes or child witnesses of crimes. Now, during the recent years, more and more research is also being conducted on children in custody dispute context, for instance, and also to some extent, but still not as much at all, on children in trafficking contexts or migration settings. But it's important to note that the key elements of a well-performed interview are the same regardless of the kind of legal position of the child. So memory and language will remain the same. I will also, in a separate lecture, talk about investigative interviews with child suspects, but certainly many of the central elements are shared in both contexts. Okay. Third key recommendation is phasing the interview, so conducting an interview according to certain very well-researched phases and also adequately preparing the child witness. And you see a funnel here in the image. This is a very well-established rule or recommendation in child interviewing, and actually, again, in any investigative interviewing, that you start with as open-ended questions as possible. Tell me everything that happened. Oh, you mentioned a man. Tell me more about the man. What happened after that? Okay. Tell me how it all started. Okay, and what happened then? And then when you've exhausted all the possible information that you can through these open-ended questions and cued open-ended questions, so you refer back to something but still ask for more descriptions, then you can go to more focused questions such as timing and how a person looked and if you knew them from before, etc. And only in the end, if all possible ways have been used to get that information in other ways, can you go to more really direct questions such as, did you know him from before, if this has been kind of impossible to settle in any other way. And this is one of the really important things to remember. Generally, the different phases of the interview are introduction, getting to know the child, conducting a practice interview, going into the substantive part, and closure. And this is just a very brief description of these. You will see them in, for example, the NICHD protocol, much better outlined. But all of these should be conducted in a child-friendly way, including making efforts to build adequate rapport with the child throughout. Key recommendation 4 is about how the investigator thinks. And this is incredibly important in all criminal investigations, and it is incredibly important for court professionals to keep an eye also on this part. We know that human beings are very prone to confirmation bias, which means that if we have an assumption of how something has happened, for instance, that a child has been sexually abused by a certain person, we are simply as human beings shaped in the way that we will only see or be more likely to see information supporting this assumption, and we might be quite blind for information pointing in other directions. When we look at cases gone wrong, so miscarriages of justice, this confirmation bias is, I would say, really among the top causes, and it's often underlying other causes. So this is important, and this is nothing you can be trained away from. We really share this thing as human beings, that we are prone to confirmation bias, but there are ways in which to minimize these effects. And one of them, which is especially written about in the context of child investigative interviews, is hypothesis testing. So when you have a suspicion that a child may have been abused, often you do not know from the onset of an investigation whether any crime has happened at all, or whether the suspicion comes from some other source. Then you have to kind of list all possible explanations to the suspicion and deliberately try to find information proving or disproving each one of them. During the last years, Liisa Järvilehto in Finland and other scholars as well have been looking at how large language models could help investigators formulate alternative hypotheses. And in fact, there is quite promising research regarding this. So there we might be helped, but certainly experts should always be in charge of the thinking and then critically use LLMs, large language models, for their work. But there is some promise in regards to LLMs assisting human experts in this area. The key recommendation 5 is that child interviews should absolutely and always, without exception, be recorded, preferably video recorded. Otherwise, it's impossible to know how the child's account has evolved. Children may also be using words in a way that is might be unfamiliar to the adult, so it might be really, really difficult to get or important to go back to what the child actually said and what it may mean with it. And it is also crucial to be able to assess interview quality and evaluate the investigative interview. And here there is quite a discrepancy globally and in Europe as well. So some countries have for a very long time already used video-recorded child interviews in court as evidence. But in some countries, children are still obliged to be, I would almost use the word victimized by cross-examination in court. And I think there's quite a large agreement by experts that this should not be the case. Children should be heard on video-recorded interviews, and this should be used as the evidence later in court. And of course, it implies that you have to be able to pose, for example, questions by the defense to the child already in the pre-trial investigative phase. So it kind of moves part of what is going on in the trial usually to the pre-trial investigation. This has been working well, for instance, in the Nordic countries for decades already, and I do not think professionals would go back to where we were. It's also important for being able to train professionals in investigative interviewing skills, because if you do not know what they are actually doing, it's very hard to say what is not going well and what is going well. Key recommendation 6 looks at the number of persons present at the interview, and the general recommendation is that they should be as few as possible. You may have people in an adjunct room watching through a video link what is going on. And this may be very important also for the investigator to be supported in, or the interviewer to be supported in what they should still ask, for instance, for possible cross-examination. But for the child to feel comfortable and at ease in the interviewing situation, and for creating rapport with the actual interviewer, it is important that the number of people in the room should be minimized. We have an increasingly multicultural society, and this is, of course, very important to note also in the legal criminal justice setting, and with children in the investigative interview. And this means that if the investigative interviewer knows they will be interviewing a child with a different cultural background to themselves, it is highly recommended to try to find out some information about this cultural background, at least be aware that you come from your own cultural background. You have to have a certain cultural humility, as Professor Annelies Vredevelt states it, to not to be kind of judging or assessing children or their accounts based on your own cultural references. Also, interpreters are, of course, incredibly important here, because interviewing children requires highly specialized skills if an interpreter is actually the one posing the questions, they also need to understand what suggestibility is, why you really have to pose questions in an open-ended way. So it's not enough to ask them to say just exactly how I say. They really need some more in-depth understanding on this. The 8th recommendation is not to use dolls, body diagrams, or drawings in child interviews. With drawings, though, I must add that if you have an older child who has described an event, they can certainly be asked to draw, and there is some research showing that people in general can remember some new details while drawing, so that's not a problem. But there has been a more clinical, maybe slightly old-fashioned psychological use of drawings where children have drawn something that then has been subject to interpretation as to imply a certain sexual act or victimization. And certainly no drawings that require any further interpretation should ever be used. Anatomically detailed dolls have been used, and we do discourage, research does discourage the usage of them because they are often linked to heightened suggestibility. The 9th key recommendation is actually very cautious. It's considered online child interviewing. There is quite some research already noting that online child interviewing can actually work very well, and children can even be less suggestible when they are heard online. And sometimes adolescents may find it quite comfortable not to be in the same room as the interviewee when talking about intimate and difficult sexual matters, for instance. However, we need to be very, very sure that these online interviews are conducted in a way that in every way is safe. And we do not have common, systems in place for that in Europe. So it's important to continue the research and in small and well thought through steps develop a way in which we can be certain that the possible benefits of interviewing remotely are paired with guarantees for security. And then the last recommendation, training of interviewers. I think by now it's evident why this training is important. I'm a bit sad to say that in most countries in Europe, there is not a coherent training for all those professionals who interview children. But clear improvements are being made, and we know quite a lot about how this training should take place. And we have more and more support also by, for instance, quite efficient online training platforms to be used side by side or together with more traditional means of teaching and learning. Thank you for my part, and we will continue in another lecture talking specifically about child suspects and how they should be met and interviewed in the criminal justice procedures.